is it that really makes me tick when you strip away all the superficial features at any given pursuit? Now I feel like if life throws me yet another curveball, which it has many, many times since my violin career ended, I have something sturdy to hold on to.
When I woke up, very confused, she said, "You almost died last night. In fact, no one can believe you were alive."
I went into the games not knowing what was coming.
As humans, we just hate uncertainty.
You just sensed that it was out there.
You have to start somewhere.
We're all programmed to push ourselves even farther.
This is On the X, an IRONCLAD original. Hey everybody, welcome to On the X. I'm Chris Irwin, and today my guest is Maya Shanker. Maya is a cognitive scientist and the creator, executive producer, and host of the podcast, A Slight Change of Plans, Apple's best show of the year in 2021. To say that the rest of her resume is impressive would be kind of an understatement. She has a postdoctoral fellowship in cognitive neuroscience from Stanford, a Ph.D. in cognitive psychology from Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, and a BA from Yale. She served as the first behavioral science advisor to the United Nations under Ban Ki-moon and a senior advisor in the Obama White House, where she founded and served as chair of the White House Behavioral Science Team. And she's currently a senior director of behavioral economics at Google. We all know stories of people who overcame a personal tragedy and made it a defining moment in their lives for the better. Maya kind of built her career and message around that essential concept and how we handle change. She's basically a change expert. Here we go with Maya Shanker on the X. I think where I want to start is, first of all, can you just kind of explain, you're a cognitive scientist, and I'm not sure I know even exactly what that means, especially in relation to like neuroscientists, which there's a lot, I would say there's a fair number of neuroscientists in the public sphere now who talk about things. Can you make a distinction there of exactly what the difference?
Yes, absolutely. So cognitive science is an interdisciplinary field, which means that we study the mind from multiple perspectives. So we do look at it from a neuroscientific perspective, but also psychology, linguistics, philosophy, computer science, biology, sometimes anthropology. And so the idea is that you ask some question about the mind, but you try to approach it from multiple angles or multiple perspectives so that you have a more well-rounded understanding of what's going on. In terms of my focus over the years, I've really been interested in human behavior and what drives our beliefs and attitudes about the world around us and all those factors that influence those sorts of things. And so I guess being a cognitive scientist means being really excited about the mind and trying to understand as much about it as I can.
So let me ask a couple questions there. One is, what got you interested in that? Like what put you down that path where you thought, and I will also say, hearing you say that, I feel like, man, I almost missed something I would really like to study a lot, especially now.
I love that.
It really interests me, that idea of sort of holistic mind study, so to speak. So what got you interested in that? And then I'd love to know how you define the mind. What is the mind in your estimation? Because I have my own kind of feelings on that, like what I consider a mind to be, but I'm curious if there is an established scientific definition of it too.
Yeah, so I'll start with the first one, which is I initially had no idea that cognitive science was a field and had no interest in it. And that's because growing up, I was an aspiring concert violinist. Right. So I was really excited about potentially becoming a professional. I had studied at Juilliard from the time that I was 9 years old. And all those dreams got shattered in a moment when at 15, I had a sudden hand injury. I tore tendons in my hand, and over time, doctors finally told me that I had to give up playing altogether. And of course, I was totally devastated, Chris, because this had been my whole life up until this point. And so I wasn't quite sure what would follow. I discovered this book called The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker. And it details our marvelous ability to both understand and produce language. And up until that point, I had completely taken my language abilities for granted. I mean, I never really thought about them. But when Pinker pulled the curtain back and taught me just how complex the cognitive machinery was that was operating behind the scenes that was allowing me to learn language when I was a child and then continue to generate language, my mind was totally blown. And I remember developing a really deep fascination for all that it is we're capable of. I mean, I remember in that moment thinking, wow, if this is what's behind language, then what's behind all sorts of other extraordinary abilities that we have as humans. And so that's initially what lit me up when it came to my interest in studying the mind. Your second question is a very, very interesting one that I've never been asked before. And I'm curious to know what your definition is before I weigh in on the matter.
Yeah. So this is something I'm very personally interested in, just as a veteran and as somebody who has navigated sort of, challenges with mental health, post-service, that type of thing. And obviously that's a challenge for a lot of people. And it's such a hot topic, so to speak, and rightfully so. And we have a lot of focus these days on things like brain health. Like that's a big thing, especially in like the veteran and military community, right? Or in professional sports, like with the NFL, where brain injury is a real potential for people. But I think sometimes we conflate those things and we get really focused on sort of the material aspect of what's going on here, of this organ that's in our head. And in my estimation, well, brain health is really important, obviously. Like we don't want to destroy our brains, but I clearly, but I make the distinction of, and again, this is sort of like my uneducated opinion here, of your brain is, again, an organ that's in your body, just like any other organ, like your heart or your lungs or anything like that. But your mind is like the output. It's the energy, right? And we're not 100% sure. You could correct me on this, of exactly where that energy comes from, whether like the brain produces it or it's, there's all these theories about it even being part of a universal consciousness or something like that. It's downloading it or receiving it like a radio. But I always make this distinction of, you're a musician. I don't know if you still play any instruments, but
no, I'm terrible at the violin now.
I'm so sorry about that. But look, I mean, obviously, it's taken you on a path that's incredible and brought you to where you are now, and I'd love to get into that too. But I'm a musician. I play the guitar, and I've done that for 30 years. And I always think of like my body as an instrument, and my brain is part of that, like the strings of the guitar. But the mind is the music, right? And that music is nothing that I can really point to. I can't like pinpoint it somehow. It's ephemeral, so it's only existing right now. Anyway, that's kind of my take on it, and I'd love to get your feedback on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a somewhat reductionist view about the mind, which is that I think everything that we experience and think and feel can be reduced to physical states in our minds. And I mean, I do think that it is an absolutely extraordinary thing that these electrical signals in our brain can give rise to such rich mental experiences. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary that we have this thing called qualia where we actually do feel we have this first person perspective of like what it is to be us and to also experience all these rich phenomena all the time. And so I feel gratitude, because I think at times people can feel a little bit depressed by that narrative. Like, man, all the stuff that I'm thinking, like, is falling in love just a bunch of chemical reactions? Is my enjoyment of a sunset just a bunch of chemical reactions? Are all the feelings that I'm feeling just a bunch of electrical signals? And so, yes, I do think that's the case. But I also think that there's something very awe-inspiring about that, which is how remarkable is it that a bunch of signals can give rise to this extraordinary firsthand experience.
Yeah.
And so I actually see gratitude in that. I mean, it didn't have to be so. We could easily have existed and operated on planet Earth without this rich inner experience. And so I see it as kind of I see it as an awe-inspiring thing rather than a, sadder, more reductionist.
Oh, 100%. I think it has to be. I mean, that's definitely the interpretation I would like to take too. There's a bunch of places I want to go with that. But before we get to that, just on on the injury that you suffered as a musician, was that playing the instrument that you were injured?
It was. I mean, Chris, I have to say I'm very sheepish on a Navy SEAL podcast talking about my, small stakes hand injury.
Yeah.
Though I like to think I make the violin an extreme sport of some kind. But
Sure, it can be.
yeah, so what happened is I get very, very sheepish. So this was a big deal in the world of being a violinist, and it was not at all a big injury in the world of just being a human being. So just to say that up front. But it's a very detail-oriented pursuit. And so what happened is I was playing a very, very challenging technical passage that required that my fingers stretch very, very far. And so in this particular case, it was my pinky finger, and I overstretched it on a single note, and I heard a popping sound. And unfortunately, it was not a string that had popped, but a tendon in my hand. And it just never healed properly. I mean, I had surgery, I did tons of physical therapy, took a ton of anti-inflammatories. I basically just played through pain for a long period of time because, I was that recalcitrant, stubborn teenager that didn't want to give up her dreams and thought, well, I'll just play through the pain. And then eventually, after surgery didn't work, my doctors did tell me, look, you've got to just stop playing altogether. And that's when I had the pivot to cognitive science.
Yeah. Wow. So I think, based on the limited time we have, and that's really the focus of kind of your work now, I think I want to kind of go that direction. As much as I would love to go down a rabbit hole of just sort of consciousness and the mind and all of that, but let's go into kind of the work you sought there or the way you went with your career, and then kind of what that led you to sort of focus on. With a lot of what you talk about is change, right? Is this idea of like having this major shift in your life. And I think what's so interesting is there's a lot of people out there who have suffered some kind of major setback or a tragedy, and that has then defined their lives moving forward, right? They've turned that setback into victory, into success, whatever that may look like. And that was certainly the case with you. What's so interesting with you is you've like centered on that concept as your like moving forward thing, right? Like the idea, the ethos there of the platonic form of that has become kind of your thing, which is so cool. So I definitely want you to get into that. And I think too, I want to highlight, it's a very relevant topic in my circles, again, with like veterans, because people who get out of the military they're faced with that exact same kind of thing. It may not be like a tragedy necessarily, but it's a big shift, right? It's a life-altering thing. If you spend decades, certainly, in a job that for a lot of people they feel like it defines their purpose, and then they're left with, okay, what do I do now? That's hard and that's challenging. So can you talk about what that was like for you, and then like what you teach people about this, about how you can kind of take whatever it is, this major shift in your life, whether it's a tragedy or just something that's way different than you're used to, and turn that into something where you've got a mission moving forward and a purpose.
Yeah. I mean, I want to start off by saying that change is very scary, and it's part of our human wiring to be quite intimidated by change and all of the uncertainty that accompanies it. And that's because as humans, we just hate uncertainty. It makes us super uncomfortable. There's this one really fascinating research study which shows that we're actually more stressed out when we're told we have a 50% chance of getting an electric shock than when we're told we have a 100% chance of getting an electric shock. And I mean, that's quite stunning, right? Because that's a situation where we would rather be absolutely certain that a bad thing is going to happen to us than to have to wrestle with any feelings of ambiguity or uncertainty. And for any transition that we go through in our lives, and this is especially true of veterans, change involves loss of some kind, right? You are parting with a former way of being and entering a new way of being. And whatever that transition is, however fraught or not fraught it is, it does involve some degree of mourning and grief and readjustment, right, to life. There's one concept here that I thought might be helpful to your listeners, which is something called identity foreclosure. And it refers to the idea that we can prematurely commit to a specific identity before having fully explored all the other ways and all the other things that we can be in this world. And so I certainly fell prey to identity foreclosure when I was that little kid playing the violin. I mean, I think I defined myself almost exclusively as being a violinist. And I really hadn't built a very robust identity outside of being a violinist. And there are benefits to that kind of foreclosure because it makes you absolutely singularly minded and focused on achieving a particular goal, right? It makes decision-making in life easier, right? When I had to prioritize the violin over other competing priorities, it actually felt pretty clear what the right answer was. And so there are many benefits to anchoring ourselves to a specific identity. But the downside, which is what I saw play out in my own life, is that suddenly I could no longer do the very thing that had defined me all along. And I found that very, very destabilizing. And I remember feeling surprised that I wasn't just grieving the loss of the instrument. I was also grieving in many ways the loss of myself. And that can be a hard realization to have, right? Oh my God, I put so much of my worth and my value in this one single pursuit, and now I can't do it. And over time, as I've been reflecting on this, I've tried to figure out, was there a more sustainable or robust way of defining myself where I could still get the benefits of identity and how that propels us forward and how that motivates us, but without incurring so many of the potential costs in the face of change? And what I realized from that process of discovery is that if I anchored my sense of self not to what I do, but instead to why I do that thing, that can be much more sustainable. So I asked myself, okay, Maya, what did you love about the violin? Like, sure, I loved the way that it felt to play and I loved the music I was producing. But actually, one of the primary traits that I loved about the violin was that it allowed me to emotionally connect with other people. So I could connect through, and you're a guitar player, right? So you understand this. It's a beautiful experience to connect with your fellow musicians or with your audience and to make people feel something they've maybe never felt before. And that was something that really got me excited. And I realized, oh, okay, so when it comes to the underlying features of the violin that I really love, it's actually a thirst for human connection, right? It's desire for human connection. And interestingly, I've been able to find that same quality and that same feature in so much of what I've done since. So as a cognitive scientist, I study the science of human connection and human behavior. In my work as a podcaster, host of A Slight Change of Plans, it's all about forging deep emotional connections with people. And so in defining that why, right, and figuring out what is it that really makes me tick when you strip away all the superficial features at any given pursuit, now I feel like if life throws me yet another curveball, which it has many, many times since my violin career ended, I have something sturdy to hold on to that can serve as a guide for me as I figure out my next steps. And so I would urge those who are listening to ask themselves, like, what is my through line? What is that underlying identity and set of traits that I really attach myself to? And what are ways that I can find that in new places when I can no longer do the thing I was doing before?
Yeah. Is there a way to codify that because it sounds like you sort of figured that out, right? You kind of like were thinking a lot. And I think about this a lot too, just in context, again, of transitioning out of, coming up with like what brought me to this actually originally was I heard Evan Hafer, he's the CEO of Black Rifle Coffee, and he was on Joe Rogan, and he was talking about his transition out. And he said at some point he just wrote down a very simple mission statement for himself, this idea, and I can't remember exactly, it was like to successfully transition out of the military and lead a happy and fulfilling life, something like that. And I heard that and thought, oh, that's nice. And then I went back to it and thought, that's a really good idea. Like giving yourself a personal mission. Because we're very used to the idea of a mission. I mean, a lot of people, or even a mission statement in terms of an organization.
Yeah.
And so that's what eventually I tried to do the same thing. And I tell you, it was way harder than I thought it was going to be. But for me, it was like, I basically was like, okay, I'm going to sort of write down all my values. Like, what do I really care about in life? And then I'm going to try to craft that into some kind of simple statement. And I just found that to be a really useful tool. I know Simon Sinek has a version of that too, something that he's got a book about it. But is there a process that you espouse for something like that? Or is it just kind of like sit down and meditate and kind of think about what matters to you?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, I love that you did this exercise. And I'm wondering actually if you can share what you ended up with in terms of your mission statement.
Oh gosh.
If you don't mind.
Yeah. Well, the other thing about it is I think it's fluid. It can change over time. I mean, this is, I think, part of the issue with a lot of people is we get locked into an identity, whether it's defined by our job or whatever it may be. And then we're so tied to it that we feel like we can't break out of this. And I think it's it's good to do, but you need to be willing to say, in my estimation, hey, this is my mission statement for now, but it might be different a year from now or a week from now or whatever it may be. So it's changed recently. I actually recently kind of looked at that again and rewrote it. And it's something, honestly, I don't know it. I should know it off the top of my head, but because I changed it recently. But it essentially was basically to speak honestly without fear, and to never forget to laugh at yourself. Something like that,
I love that.
'Cause
very hopeful.
well, I take a piece of that from my dad. Always used to say, take your responsibilities seriously and yourself not at all. And I always thought that was such a great statement, because I, like a lot of people, can be prone to taking myself too seriously. But I always the other piece of it for me is just, I have a background of kind of anxiety. And for me, it's like getting back to that idea of like, don't be afraid of yourself, what you think, what you want to talk about, what you want to say, any of that. It's almost like a reminder every day of like, make sure you're getting back to this again, defining your values, and then and then find a career that aligns with that.
Right. Yeah,
because
exactly.
I think in my estimation, a lot of military people, we just don't realize that we went out and joined the service because the service's values aligned with our own. And it's not that the job gave us purpose. It's just that the purpose there was aligned with us, right? And I just think that that's such a valuable lesson. And it's true, I think, for anybody, right?
Yeah, and I think it echoes, what I was sharing earlier, which is that's a case where that underlying feature, that drive, comes from a desire to be of service, right? That's such a powerful defining trait. You can find the ability to give back and to serve others through so many different outlets. And so it's hard for me to imagine in this moment a more sustainable source of value than that one.
Right.
Source of identity than that one.
Yeah.
And it's also perhaps potentially the most pro-social identity that one can have.
Yeah.
In terms of how to, you asked about kind of codifying this.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. I think I stumbled upon this really just recently in the last few years, even though this violin injury happened over 20 years ago, right? So it took me some time. One insight that is potentially useful to people is that when you're trying to figure out what it is that underlies the things you do, what it is that you love deep down about the things you do, you can often look to early childhood for some insight. And we subconsciously or consciously express these interests when we're growing up in terms of what we're drawn to, these sorts of activities that we're drawn to. And so I remember as a kid, just being fascinated by human relationships, right? I was all in on like, oh, I want to know what happened to so-and-so and so-and-so on the playground and what's their dynamic. And, another kid might have been over in the corner, like aggressively playing sports or something like that instead, and really enjoying getting better at his craft or their craft. And so I think you can look back, when you were given just free time to play as a child, where did you find yourself gravitating? And that can help you identify what some of these traits might be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know I've heard a lot about free play just in general, of how beneficial that is for like developing mind, right? And it's one of those things, I don't know about this actually in terms of science, but is there anything that says, is there a version of free play as an adult? Like, what does that look like? What is it? Is it messing around on an instrument that you don't know how to play? Is it, you know what I mean? What does that look like as an adult?
Well, it can take many forms, and actually one that most of us don't utilize in the era of smartphones and having, entertainment or stimulation available to us really at a moment's notice, is just experiencing the empty thoughts and boredom of sitting and staring. I mean, think about how rarely you do that in any given day, Chris, right?
Oh, yeah.
My instinct the minute I get a free moment is, okay, let me grab my phone, and then, all these bad habits, scrolling Instagram, going on the web, whatever it is. But I really have tried to almost force myself to engage in slightly more focused moments of this kind of open, expansive creativity and play, where you're just sitting there and you let your mind wander to new places, but you don't allow any new stimulation in. And that's when the most magical creativity happens. I mean, that's when you have new thoughts. And I've seen this a lot in my work, where I would have been struggling with a particular problem or challenge that I couldn't figure out when I was at my computer. And then suddenly, I mean, we all have this experience. I'm in the shower. I didn't even know that I was consciously trying to troubleshoot that problem or even reason through it. But all of a sudden, an answer or some clarity comes to mind. And I think, oh my gosh, thank goodness I allowed my mind to just wander and do its thing, because it actually got me the answer or solution that I was hoping for. So that's certainly the case. And then, like you said, I play, though this is obviously a much more effortful form of play, is absolutely to learn new skills. And then, like you said, it's a wonderful exercise, though, of course, it's far more effortful to try and always learn new things. I mean, our ability and our desire to learn new things as we age definitely diminishes. In childhood, we're constantly exploring and seeking new information and learning new skills. And just because of the constraints of everyday adult life and all the responsibilities that we bear, we just often find little time to do those sorts of things. But if we can carve out meaningful time in which we can, in fact, learn something new, and in the process experience the discomfort of not knowing how to do something, that is when the brain grows, right? Yeah. When you fail at something or you make a mistake, that's signaling to your brain, hey, the current networks, they're not doing their job. We got to fix something in here. And that's when you see these amazing neuroplastic benefits and all the other cognitive benefits that come alongside learning a new skill. So if people have it within them, it's really hard. I started learning Mandarin a couple of years ago, and there were many moments where I thought, oh my gosh, life would be a lot easier if I did not have this very hard thing that I try to do, once a week with my teacher. But I did absolutely find that my mind was expanding in all sorts of beautiful ways. And so I would certainly encourage that.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that idea of, I never thought of it this way, but sort of boredom being the parent of creativity, right? Or boredom being the parent
so well said.
Of free play. That's so well said. And on the skill stuff, I'm such a huge advocate of skill development. I just think it's one of these things where we sort of know that our bodies over time are eventually going to start to decline, right? Like we can stave that off, and I know you're an exercise enthusiast.
Yes.
As am I. And so, we can do our best there, but more than likely, unless we were severely out of shape earlier in life, more than likely when I'm 70, I'm not going to be as fit as when I was 40 or 50. But mentally, absent any kind of condition like dementia or something like that, or Alzheimer's, it's like we can learn a new skill, right? Even in our 70s or 80s. And that's making new neurons and connections in our brains and everything, right? Like my mother-in-law, she started playing guitar when she was, I think, 73 or something like that. It was in her 70s.
Fantastic.
Right? And so, and to that point of kind of what we're talking about of free play, I just think too, once you start doing, one, I love skills because it's doing that. It's like literally growing your brain. But then it also is such a great, I think, distraction from potentially chatter that's going on in your mind, because you have to focus on what you're doing. And you can get into kind of this flow state when you're learning something where there's just no way to focus on anything else.
Yes.
But then to the point you're making there, now you have an outlet where you can do free play, right? Once you're good enough at like I started playing piano about 4 or 5 years ago, trying to add to kind of my musical instrument repertoire a little bit. Always wanted to learn piano. And once you get to a certain level, now you can just sit down and go, you know what? I'm not going to try to read notes or anything. I'm just going to plunk around on this thing and see if I can create something, which I just think is such a great capacity.
Yeah, I really like the focus on boredom, because we are living in a culture where hyper productivity is championed, and people are screaming from the rooftops, utilize every single moment of your day. I don't think I've ever heard the word optimize more than I have in the last year, let's say, on social media, right? So everyone's looking for these optimization strategies. And so intuitively, it can feel like we are wasting time when we're not taking advantage of the fact we're we have a 15-minute walk in our schedule. Why am I not listening to a podcast? Okay, I'm doing the dishes. Why am I not, making a phone call at the same time? But actually, it's that those periods. And again, I'm like the biggest culprit of multitasking. So I have to be super deliberate about introducing these periods of stillness into my life. But I found that my creative potential has really grown as a result, and that I just do better work when I allow for some of those periods of stillness and calm.
Do you have a practice, like a mindfulness practice, meditation or breath work or anything like that you do?
I do not. I wish that I did because look, having studied neuroscience, I know all the benefits of meditation, yet I can't do it because I'm just too impatient. And I guess the closest form of meditation for me is just exercise, which I enjoy so much. I love exercising. I love strength training. I love just feeling like I'm getting stronger. There's something so intoxicating about that. And
for me too.
That would probably be the closest I get to being a meditator. But I both fully endorse the practice and can't find it in myself to do it.
Yeah. Well, so this kind of leads me into the next thing I want to get into, because you've talked about a lot. You've used the word identity a bunch.
Yeah.
And so some of that has to do with your identity. At least you come across as a very joyful person, like very ebullient, just kind of like naturally kind of happy a lot, right? And how do you define identity? I've been thinking about this, listening to some of your content and leading up to this, of like how do you distinguish? How do we distinguish between the way we are and the way we do things, right? Like, what are there pieces about us, not just like our height and weight, like height and eye color and things like that? Are there immutable ways that we just are in life, or is it all just a measure of the way we've lived, behavior over time, our environment, things like that? Like, it's a little of this kind of nature versus nurture argument, but I'm just very curious about that.
Part of this is a deep philosophical question about like what makes us us.
Yeah.
And then part of it is, what role do genes play in our development versus what role the environment plays? And it is just an open question. It's an empirical question. We will almost certainly never find out the answer to any specific question around how much is this trait nature versus nurture. It's a very, very, very hard thing to research and to study and to measure. That said, I think there is an advantage to seeing our identities as malleable to the extent that we can, because genes might limit the window in which we can grow, right? Like for you, for example, you might have a much larger band than I do in terms of like fitness potential or whatnot, right? But we always can improve within our band. And I think that adopting that kind of growth mindset and understanding that, yes, we might have some fixedness around us. I don't want anyone to be, that while we might have certain things that are fixed to some degree, like the length of the band, we can't be naive and pretend that there's no limitations that we face. Of course we do as a result of our genes. There's almost always some degree of growth that's available to us if we are very intentional about it. And so I think I try to focus on that. I appreciate you calling out my joyfulness. I will also say that, you mentioned anxiety, and I definitely had my fair share of anxiety. You mentioned mental chatter. I think like mental chatter is my worst enemy. I could definitely get really stuck in these.
I think that's true for almost everybody.
Ruminations and loops. And it's an ongoing struggle, right? To try to limit that mental chatter or that really negative drill sergeant that's in our head telling us really critical things. And in those moments, actually, I really do try to turn to the research and what psychology teaches us about what we can do when we're in the throes of chatter. And one thing that I've been more conscious about is doing what the psychologist called Ethan Kross calls it distancing techniques. This is when we explicitly zoom out on our problems and try and take a third person perspective on those problems so that we're not mired in all of the emotions and the heat of the moment, and we can actually see our problems and advise ourselves almost like we were advising a friend. In fact, he finds that even a small tweak to the language we use, so referring to ourselves in the third person, can actually forge some of the emotional distance that we would benefit from if we were in fact being advised, or if we were in fact advising a friend.
Until we get to the point where we're always referring to ourselves in the third person, and,
yes,
and
that
then it gets weird.
But in moments where you feel like that distance can help you, it can be great to kind of zoom out and take a fly on the wall perspective and see your mental chatter from a slightly different vantage point. And so anyway, that is to say that I do think that there is an element of joyfulness that is cultivated and that I work at, and I think because being a human is hard, and we face lots of challenges in our lives. And so I'm grateful to the field of cognitive science and psychology for giving us tools and techniques that we can work on and cultivate over time so that we can build our resilience.
Yeah. Are there advantages to identifying with a certain thing, whether that's a job or an instrument or what, right? I just think of like even my own career, there's certainly a portion of time where you say things like, I am a Navy SEAL. And I think about that abstractly and to the point of, okay, is that even right? It's more like that's what I'm doing as a job. Like I'm doing Navy SEAL stuff, right? I'm doing doing this job, not necessarily being it. And again, I wonder about, are there advantages and disadvantages to that kind of approach? Because again, sort of boiling it down, I was thinking about this. Like if I'm just sitting here and I'm not doing, like I have my eyes closed and I'm trying to meditate, in that state, how do I define myself of like what I am? And I was listening to the most recent episode of your podcast with, I think her name was Dr. Becky, and talking about kids and, saying, hey, when a kid does something that's out of line or whatever, it's not that they're a bad kid. They're a good kid. They're just behaving badly. But I was even thinking of that, of like, well, what does it mean to be good, right? Like, what is that? Just an average of the things you do? So it's like, average over time, your behaviors or your patterns, generally speaking, are good. Therefore, I am good. Or is there some other, again, immutable quality there that I can tap into? And I struggle to find it. And it's a kind of interesting thing that I was wrestling with leading up to this.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I should say that if I were a Navy SEAL, I would get it tattooed on my forehead that I was a Navy SEAL. And I would just be yelling it from the rooftops that I was a Navy SEAL, because you guys are the ultimate badasses. Sorry, I mean guys in a gender neutral way. Sorry, let me just take that one more time. Because
I use guys as well, just to refer to people.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Because you all are just total, sorry, I would just yell it from the rooftops that I was a Navy SEAL because you all are such badasses. And I've read all these, I'm just obsessed with Navy SEALs. So I read books on it and I'm like just so constantly in awe of what you all do. So to your very narrow question about whether when you're sitting in silence meditating, you should think about yourself as a Navy SEAL. Yes, Chris, you should, because it's awesome that you are. Okay, more broadly for the normal people like me who are wrestling with identity, I think there's no, as I was saying earlier in the conversation, I think there are many advantages to anchoring ourselves to what we do and to specific identities because they're inherently motivating, right? So when you think of yourself as an aspiring Navy SEAL, let's say, you're going to work harder, right, to try to get over the finish line. Or if I identify myself as a scientist, maybe I might work harder at my research. There's also an instant sense of belonging and community that you inherit when you associate yourself with these labels, right? So you are a member of, you have your Navy SEAL peers, and that's a big deal. And you feel this instant camaraderie with them. In the same way that when I was a musician growing up, I had my classical musician friends and I felt part of that community. So I definitely think there are upsides to attaching our identity. The thing that I would caution people against is attaching too much of their identity to any one thing. I think this is where we benefit from diversity by carrying lots of roles and labels and identities. And that way, if one ends up being compromised in some way, there's other rich sources that we can call upon in those moments so that we don't feel completely unmoored.
Right. And probably allowing that to be fluid over time, right? Not getting again so locked into it. Because I would say certainly the opposite could be true too, right? If we get too shackled to an identity that is like, I am a failure, I'm a bad person or whatever. Obviously that it can go the other way too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I was going to make a comment of like, I appreciate all of the sort of, the nice compliments there. It's not, I would put them right back on you in terms of like an impressive resume of, Juilliard. I mean, these are things like Juilliard. That sounds like a lot of fun to me. I would have loved to done that, Yale, Rhodes Scholar, White House advisor. Like,
I'm sorry, I'm just going to shut down this competition right now that you win. But that's fine. I mean, I appreciate your humoring me with the comparison. Even the comparison flattering.
In that category, though, we actually do have something in common in that we went to rival graduate schools in England. So I went to Cambridge.
Oh, you were at Cambridge.
Yep.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
That's awesome. What did you study there?
Technically international relations. I'm not sure that I learned much while I was there, but I think I essentially majored in going out to pubs and hanging out with the modern pentathlon team. So that was kind of what I did.
Fantastic.
So I know we're probably coming up on time here. The last thing that I want to get to a little bit, it's sort of dovetailing on this, but it's and I don't know if I've heard you talk about this. No, I have heard you speak about this. Is the idea of kind of talent. Because I've heard you say when you talk about your background and being a musician, people saying, "Oh, she's a prodigy," and you're like, "No, I'm not a prodigy." There were people. I think the girl's name was Rachel Lee, something like that.
Yeah, you have a great name.
Did I get it right?
Yes.
Who like she was a prodigy. But do you feel like we put way too much emphasis on that? Because I hear it all the time where we have a compliment. We tell people you're so talented, and that's a compliment. And in my mind, it doesn't make any sense because it's nothing they earned. It's like saying you're tall, or again, you have blue eyes or something like that. And I just think it's a very bizarre way that we act. I don't know if it's a cultural thing for us. I definitely feel talent is a thing, but it's almost more impressive if somebody isn't talented and becomes successful in that field, right? I'm just curious on your thoughts on that.
And I could not agree more. I think some of the greatest joys that I've experienced in my life have not been when I've, in absolute terms, reached the highest peaks, but when I've gone from a very low point to a higher point in some skill that I was trying to build. And so I think our starting point is very relevant because again, one of the greatest joys for me in life is getting better and learning and improving at things. And when you start off at a low point, there's usually a lot of room for growth. That's one element of it. But you're absolutely right. I mean, when we use terms like talent, we are definitely encouraging a more fixed mindset. When we talk about how much progress someone's made, or we talk about how hard they're working, that's the part that's actually in their control and that we should focus the most on. Because, it can be kind of demoralizing if you don't have talent, then, well, what are you supposed to do? Or you don't have as much.
Right.
What are you supposed to do? When in actuality, you probably still have a ton of potential and could get a lot better.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think of my own kids. Like I have 3 boys, but I have an 11-year-old son who a couple years ago, he was struggling with spelling, and he would come home and he would just say like, I'm not good at spelling. And it was like, whoa, again, getting back to the identity thing, like, don't think that, it's just something you have to work on a little harder.
Yeah.
And we worked on it.
Exactly.
And it's like, we got over that of like, you can't tell yourself that kind of a story, right? I just think that
Yep.
applies. It's such a broad spectrum to everything we may think about ourselves,
So I would say that as I reflect on my own life, some of my proudest moments haven't come from when I have achieved, the greatest accomplishments
Yes.
in absolute terms, but actually have just been from when I improved the most. So obviously I achieved way higher levels in my career as a violinist, but I found myself at times taking more joy in my elementary Mandarin because I started off in such a bad place, and it's sort of really exciting to see progress.
Yeah.
And so, I think that focusing, can be a cliche to focus on the journey, but actually, when it comes to building new skills, that has to be where our focus is, because it's the only part of the process that we really have control over.
Thanks for listening to On the X, the official podcast of the Navy SEAL Foundation and an IRONCLAD original. Please like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. You can learn more about Maya Shankar at mayashankar.com. and the foundation at NavySealFoundation.org. See you next time.